after this should be live. Okay.
All right. Good morning. I'm Dave Anderson, and I serve as Vice Chair for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the board to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted in hybrid form, with some individuals remote by conference call or other electronic medium, and some individuals present at the board office. Donna Hunter Quayle.
Present.
Mary Jones, who I believe is absent. Jim Kilmartin, and I believe he's scheduled to join at 11.
That's correct.
Jacqueline Lightcap.
Here.
Richard Nobles.
Here.
Jonah Norton, is she absent?
I believe she is absent as well.
Andrea Perdomo Morales.
Present.
Cynthia Shendo.
Present.
Laura Shaughnessy, also absent.
Yes, that's correct.
Rick Steele.
Present.
Deb Stidham.
Here.
I note the following staff members are also present: David Fye, Leslie Allen,
Here.
Tyler Wadsworth,
Kyla is available for administrative support. She'll be watching it from the YouTube channel.
very good, and Jared Langford, serving as legal counsel for the board.
Present.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the board about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the board to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. Public comment has been approved for one individual at the meeting today. Because we are conducting this public meeting in hybrid form, I state for the record the following information. Access to this meeting is being conducted in person and also by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted in hybrid form, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we'll be conducting the meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On Friday, February 3rd, 2023, we sent notice of the board meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of board meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material was posted on the board's website on the day of the meeting, and that was actually posted on Friday of last week. And you may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line "request for the agenda," and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did check the conference call line. It is active, but no individuals were on the line when we started the meeting.
Thank you, David. The meeting is now called to order, and the board will begin its discussion of the first item. First item is approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I would move to approve.
Thank you. Cynthia, second. Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the agenda. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. Thank you. We'll move on to public comment. Deborah, are you there? I think you've slipped off my screen.
I am.
Oh, there you are. Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today, distinguished board. I appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of you. My name is Deborah Ramberg, and I am the General Director of Human Resources for Topeka Public Schools. Have been employed with the district for about 2.5 years, but do have about 30 plus years in HR, human resources. So I'm learning a lot about education. Recently, we had our social work coordinator come to us and request a review of the education level of our current clinical social workers. We pay on our salary schedule, we pay based upon years of experience as well as level of education. And she was wanting to have a higher consideration for a particular credential, and that is the licensed specialist clinical social worker credential. Upon my review, I felt that I agreed with our coordinator that it was comparable to a doctorate level degree, just mostly because of the years and hours that it takes to get that credential, as well as it is, I believe, considered the highest credential for a clinical social worker. When I continued my research, I realized a doctoral degree is really generally used for a career either in academic research or education, but not, so there is a probable clinical social work doctorate degree, but it would be more for someone who wanted to do research or teach as opposed to doing clinical social work. So what we were wondering is if we might get a letter of support from the board saying that you also believe this is the highest level for a clinical social worker credential, and that it would be comparable, not the same, but comparable to a doctorate level degree. I was amazed at the number of hours that it does take to get that credential. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. We also, of course, would appreciate knowing if you don't believe that this credential is comparable, because that will help us in making our decision as to whether we should raise their pay rate up to the same as a doctoral level degree or not.
Thank you, Deborah.
Mhm.
Any questions or comments from the board?
Are the currently LMSW is your highest level of pay grade in the school district?
Currently, no, we do have the LSCSW is paid at the same level. What we base ours on is master's and then so many credit hours after that. So we have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, then we have a master's plus 15, a master's plus 30, and then a doctoral degree. What we're thinking is the lower credentials are at the master's plus level, and that this one would be at this comparable to a doctorate level.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
And Debbie, if I may ask a question, thank you for taking your time this morning. Within your scope of this person's role, are they diagnosing? Are they supposed to do testing? Because usually at a doctoral level, you would be able to do testing, which you cannot do with an LSCSW. So I think part of that just depends on what your scope of work would be and what you would need them to be doing.
Certainly. They are, so they're doing clinical work with our students. And so I don't know if there's testing or not being done, but they are working with all of our student levels, so pre-K all the way up to seniors in high school, and they are working with them on a clinical aspect.
So I think when your doctoral level would come in is for those that are doing testing with the students, and the
Okay.
LSCSWs would not be able to do that.
Okay. Okay, I
But
appreciate that.
Richard and Rick and others, please chime in if that's.
No, that's correct. So,
Okay.
so licensed clinical social workers cannot engage. So I should step back. I'm Richard Nobles. I'm a clinical psychologist. So clinical social workers with that credential, they cannot engage in psychological assessments and engage in feedback of those assessments, whereas psychologists like Rick and myself can engage in those assessments because we're psychologists.
So those, and I'm wondering, so is this LSCSW, is it truly the highest credential that a clinical social worker could receive?
Yes,
Is that accurate? Okay, okay.
that is accurate.
Okay, because we also do have psychologists in the district and they, I'm sure, work very closely with our social workers to that degree. So, okay.
Any other questions or feedback?
I had one, David.
Go right ahead.
I guess my question is more to this process of requesting this letter from us. Who has to approve this difference in pay grade for you?
So it goes to the deputy superintendent and he reviews it as well. We also have our general counsel take a look because we do have a negotiated agreement. We have to make sure that it's within the parameters of that. Then of course, certainly our superintendent and our board has already approved if we wanted to make this move. They have approved it already. So our Board of Education as well.
And are you seeking an approval from any other body?
At this time, we are not.
And how critical is our approval to this process?
It would lend us some support in increasing the salary levels. We do have strong competition for social workers. So we are looking for ways to certainly compensate them. And again, mine was just looking at the amount of time that it took to get that credential is quite impressive to me. That the doctorate is between 60 to 120 credit hours and 4,000 hours for a social worker. So to me, I felt it was pretty comparable, but wanted to verify that with you to make sure that I understood the process correctly.
So our letter, then the content, if we decide to do this, would need to say basically that we thought it was comparable.
Correct.
All right,
would be
thank you.
Thank you everyone for your time. I truly appreciate it.
We appreciate your coming before us. And Dave, what's the process at this point?
Well, there are a few board members that are absent today. So when public comment is made to the board could ask questions, could have discussion. The board does not have to. And so the board could revisit this at a future meeting or not. And so there's some flexibility there in terms of what the board could do in this matter.
What's your time frame, Debbie, when you need to take this before the superintendent?
We would love to have it prior to our April 18th board meeting. April 20th board meeting. So we have a little time.
Okay, thank you.
What's the will of the board? Do you want to wait to discuss this till more people are present, or is it your desire to act on this at this point?
I'd like for us to discuss it and make a choice today.
Anyone else?
Well, a third of us are missing, and at least one person's going to hop on in about 45 minutes. I would like to see a couple of people hop on before we maybe make a decision, but I would be okay if we, definitely needed to do something today. I would be fine with doing that. I would prefer that we wait for a couple more people to weigh in on this discussion.
And Dave, am I correct that the only person we expect to join today is Jim?
That's correct. The others will be absent for this meeting. Jim said he hoped to be able to log in sometime after 11.
All right, so we've heard one request to discuss and decide today and one to wait until more of the board is present.
Could we could we possibly discuss it when Jim joins us? Delay the discussion until then.
Can I ask a quick question? I'm sorry, while we have Debbie still on. Debbie, so I hear the question being, is the LSCSW the highest level of licensure within a social work profession? And so the response was yes. And so with a doctorate degree, there's nothing really more that an LSCSW can do achieving a doctorate degree. So I think we answered that piece, but I'm just wondering, is the question that you're wanting the recommendation from the board to say that a doctoral level individual is at the same
At the same
level
pay
as a
grade. So, yeah, I'm sorry.
Pay grade.
That it's
pay
at the
grade?
at the same pay, would be considered at the same pay grade as someone with a doctoral level degree who would be out educating people. And it's a finite difference because we here work a lot with doctoral degrees because our educators, that's what they're doing, and their level is a doctoral degree, their highest level. What we're trying to do is see if you would provide a letter of support saying that the two are comparable in that they are the highest level of maybe education and training for each position, that it's comparable to a doctoral level degree for an educator. Is what we're looking for. Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, I don't know. So yeah, we can discuss this later because
Okay.
with the board.
Deborah, quick clarification. Is there anything that a person with a doctoral degree in education can do within the system that somebody with a master's degree in education could not do?
Not real. I mean, there's really not a whole lot of difference. It is the preference of the superintendent. So they might prefer that their building leaders, the principals, the administration have a doctoral degree in education, but it's just strictly a preference. It's not a requirement.
So it's an acknowledgement in the pay scale that somebody has earned that
Correct.
additional level of graduate education.
Correct.
Gotcha.
And we get to call them doctor.
All right. Currently, a request has been made that we postpone discussion of this until Jim joins us in hopefully less than an hour. Is everybody okay with that?
I'm okay with it, David. I think it gives us time to kind of chew on it. I guess from my perspective, before we move on to another agenda item, is just to say that there's a lot of factors that go into pay for positions in larger organizations. So to be honest, it kind of feels a little out of my scope to wade into those waters, but I certainly don't feel terribly strongly. I'm just throwing that in.
Very good.
And I was planning on stepping out unless you want me to stay, so you can have your conversation without anyone else listening in. So again, I thank you very much for your time. Mr. Fye certainly knows how to reach me if you do have any additional questions.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to our next item, we have several minutes to review and approve. Let's begin with January 6th. Has everybody had an opportunity to review those minutes? Any changes or modifications?
I would move to approve the January 6th meetings minutes as written.
Okay, thank you. Second?
I second.
Thank you. All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Very good. Opposed, same sign. All right. Motion approved. Let's move on to January 18th. Any changes or modifications to the January 18th minutes? If not, I'll accept a motion to approve.
So moved.
Thank you. Second.
Second.
Thank you. Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 Thank you. Opposed, same sign. Motion is approved. Finally, the February 8th minutes. Any additions, deletions, modifications? No,
I would move to approve.
thank you. Second,
Second.
thank you. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 Same sign. Motion passed. Thank you. All right. That takes us to the executive director's report. Dave.
Thank you, Dave. So I'll provide some updates on operations and legislative updates, a few other updates, and then just some general information on the licensing process and some timeframes here. For some operations updates, so the board meetings have continued to be broadcast on the YouTube channel. We started the YouTube channel back in January of 2021, and to this point, we have broadcast over 100 meetings. Those meetings have been viewed 3,343 times. So really encouraging about the number of individuals who are taking part in listening to the discussion and then contacting us with questions at times about different topics. Leslie Allen and I, the assistant director, we've been providing outreach by talking to groups of students, both about the licensing process, but also to give them advanced information about the disciplinary function the board serves, and also providing resources on our website to help them become better practitioners as they're approaching graduation. During the last period of time, since the last full board meeting, I think we've given about 4 different presentations to groups of students, and they've been well received, lots of good questions. So just a function we do on the side that I want to make you aware of some of those conversations that we have with groups of students. In terms of revenue and expenditures for the agency, through the end of February 2023, the net revenue for the agency was about $565,000, which is after the 10% statutory transfer to the state general fund, which is required by statute. Expenditures during that time period were about $543,000, although not all payments occurred with regularity month to month, and we're aware of some invoices we expect to receive that will take us to about pretty much even in terms of revenue we received this year versus expenditures for the agency. The balance in the BSRB fee fund is about $2.2 million currently. In terms of some legislative updates, first, I spoke at the last meeting about the BSRB. The agency's budget has to be approved by the legislature every year. So as a fee-funded agency, each year we come before the legislature and we don't ask them for any money. We receive no money from the state general fund for operations, but as I mentioned, by statute, we contribute 10% of our revenue to the state general fund. But each year the legislature sets a limit on how much we can spend. Even if we have money in the fund, that limit really puts a guideline in terms of how much we can spend within our fund for that year. And so the current year is fiscal year 2023, and then we submitted a budget request for the next 2 fiscal years, 2024 and 2025. On the House side, they passed our budget out of the House Budget Committee. They also added a proviso that I spoke about at the last meeting in terms of that language would say for fiscal year 23 and 24, it would prohibit the agency from requiring as a condition of licensure, continuing education or different training in the area of diversity or other similar topics. So That is still on the budget for the House version of the approved budget. That was reported out by the House Appropriations Committee, and they did not remove that language from the budget, so that is still on the House's position on the budget. On the Senate side, there's a different budget committee that heard the agency's budget. It passed out of the budget committee with no issue. It was also reported out of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So the budget has been reported out of the House committees and the Senate committees. The next step is for each chamber to put together an appropriations bill and then to run their bill on their chamber floor. And so when that happens, there's items of difference. And usually what happens when they both run their bill, they will come together and then go to conference committee and decide items of difference. So I will keep you updated as they go through those steps. They are generally away for about a 2 to 3 week time period, right around the beginning of April. And so it's possible they both may pass an appropriations bill by that point. If not, they come back and they get new information about revenue estimates, human service caseload expenditure estimates, and then they usually finish up some items at a time period called omnibus. So it's possible we could get direction on the agency's budget before then, or we could find out later in the year. But it's expected the legislative session usually wraps up towards the end of April or the beginning of May, although I have seen it extend to the middle of June at times. In terms of other legislative updates, the BSRB bill, which is House Bill 2340. I'm sorry, was there? Okay. So House Bill 2340 is the BSRB bill, and that bill was heard in the House Health and Human Services Committee. There were a number of individuals who provided testimony when that bill was heard, and there were some requests for modifications. That bill was worked, and there were 6 different amendments that were made to the bill, and I'll talk about those here in a little bit. When they made the amendments to the bill, they did pass it out of committee favorably as amended, and then it was worked on the House floor. There was one technical amendment that was made on the House floor, but the House did vote in favor of the amendment by a very wide margin, and the bill did pass the House floor. So it has been assigned to the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. I had a meeting last week with the chair of the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee, that's Senator Gossage, to request a hearing on the bill. And the tentative date for the hearing is going to be on Tuesday, March 21st. That calendar has not been published, and the dates are still tentative until that comes out. But I was informed that it would be no issue to inform you as members of the board. But so the tentative date for the bill hearing is going to be Tuesday, March 21st. I'll be speaking to the bill and requesting some modifications, but I thought I would go ahead and walk through a little bit about some of the changes that were made to the BSRB bill when it was heard in committee. So first, at the hearing, there were 8 individuals who provided proponent testimony in favor of the bill. There was one individual who provided neutral testimony, but they said they would be in favor of the bill if there was a modification that was made. And then one individual presented opponent testimony against the bill. But the individual who provided opponent testimony, they indicated that the main issue that they took with the bill was the requirement of board-approved supervision for social workers. There was also some, I believe, confusion about some of the requirements for clinical reciprocity. Some of the individuals who presented testimony at the hearing discussed that they believed there was a requirement for clinical licensees seeking reciprocity that they had to have 3 years of additional practice in their jurisdiction. And I think the confusion was that that is one of 3 options, and individuals coming in through reciprocity have to have 2 of the 3, but most individuals don't seek that as one of 2 of the 3. That's additional flexibility. So some individuals could use that as a way to come in through reciprocity, but it's definitely not required. And so Leslie Allen and I attended the hearing and clarified that information for the committee. In terms of some of the other items that were discussed, many of the proponents spoke in favor of the items that were in the bill. A lot of them talked about the items addressing workforce and how they thought these were helpful changes. Some indicated that they were in favor of the lowering of the fee to reinstate a license as well. There was one individual who spoke against the language that would have required continuing education and cultural diversity. And for the other individuals who presented testimony, I don't recall seeing any information in there addressing the cultural diversity topic. So one individual spoke against it in their testimony, and then the others, I don't believe they addressed that at the hearing. So I wanted to go ahead and kind of walk through the changes that were made when the bill was heard in the committee. And so, as you might recall, there were a number of items that addressed creating new types of temporary licenses, some that created those for the bachelor's and master's level social work for the students who were in candidacy for accreditation. There was the language that would add a new student temporary license for the addiction counseling profession. There was language to decrease the reinstatement fee for certain individuals if their license had been expired for over a year, creating and offering a new type of 6-month reinstatement temporary license if individuals had not obtained their continuing education prior to coming back and having their license fully reinstated. There were some items in the bill that talked about extending the time period for temporary licenses from 1 year to 2 year. There was the change to the reciprocity statutes that lowered those from 48 to 54 months down to 12 months for most individuals seeking licensure by reciprocity. There was the change for the licensed psychology profession for the licensure requirement of having good moral character, changing that to meriting the public trust. There was some language to modify the disciplinary remedies for the behavior analyst profession to make them more consistent with the other professions. And then there was some statutory cleanup. The items that were amended out of the bill when it was worked by the committee, and just to clarify on this process, so usually what happens when they work a bill, there is 1 day for the hearing, and that it gives an opportunity for individuals to speak in favor or against certain items in the bill. And then there's a second day, and during the second day, that's when they work the bill, and that's usually when they discuss the bill and consider amendments. And when they consider those amendments, there's usually not an opportunity for the agency or non-committee members to add input or speak to those items. So some of those amendments that the members of the committee made, one is to remove the language which would have required board-approved supervisors for social work. There was also language to remove language, or there was an amendment to remove language which would have added a board member for the behavior analyst profession. And then there was an amendment to remove language which would have required the new 3-hour requirement of continuing education in the area of cultural diversity. Now, the committee indicated that they was their preference, and they went ahead and did this to go ahead and decrease the number of hours in diagnosis and treatment from 6 hours to 3 hours. So they are keeping that item for the professions, but they are removing the language that would have added the 3 hours in cultural diversity. In terms of new items that were added, there were 3 amendments that add new language to the bill that change the bill pretty substantially. And so I wanted to share those amendments with you and walk through those and just to allow you to have some discussion on those amendments. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we can kind of walk through some of those amendments that the committee made when they were working the bill. So you should see my screen here shortly. This was an amendment that was made to House Bill 2340. This is essentially labeled as providing community-based licenses for 4 of the professions. And I'll go ahead and show you an example. The language is pretty similar, if not the same, for the 4 different professions. But essentially what this language would do, so this language would add to the statutes of the BSRB for the professional counseling profession, the social work profession, the marriage and family therapy profession, and the licensed psychology profession. It would create a new community-based license, and these would be for individuals who were employed by community mental health centers, as you see there in the highlighted item number 1. They would be issued by the board after an individual had made application for such community-based license. They would function very similar, if not exactly the same, as a temporary license, in that they would last for the same time period of up to 2 years or 24 months. If someone had passed the licensing examination prior to the completion of that, they would be able to get a permanent license and would no longer have this community-based license. In number 5, it states that they would have to be under the supervision of a clinical practitioner or someone at the independent level at a community mental health center. And then I think the most concerning item is number 4. if you read the language there, it says that a person practicing professional counseling with a community-based professional counselor license may use the title licensed professional counselor or the initials LPC independently. And there would be a fee that could be charged for this new community-based license, but otherwise the language would be pretty similar. For the social work profession, there would be a community-based license for the bachelor's level and master's level practitioners. But essentially what this appears to be is a new type of temporary license that would be exclusively for the community mental health centers that would essentially function as a temporary license. But for individuals who held this, they could pay a fee and then be able to call themselves the same name that's currently reserved for individuals with a permanent license, and they could use the same initials as individuals who hold a permanent license. And I can tell you just from my discussions with individuals about this item, it appears that there may be some issues behind the scenes with reimbursement for certain services for individuals who hold temporary licenses. And I think this was between maybe a couple of outside bodies, and this was maybe a solution to address the issue with reimbursements to allow individuals to hold this new type of license and use these letters and use these names. But in talking to our staff, I think there are some concerns that individuals who would do this would essentially put themselves out the same way that currently individuals do that have a permanent license. And I think also one concern that we had too is if this was something that would go into law, I think it runs the risk of individuals from the public maybe not just having confusion about those individuals, but perhaps questioning anyone who uses these initials currently. Because if these are currently used for individuals with a permanent license, but we create a new type of essentially temporary license where you can use these terms for a fee, I think it could call into question anybody using these initials currently, whether or not they actually have a permanent license or whether they have a new type of temporary license that allows them to do this. So wanted to bring this to your attention and see if you had any thoughts. I did have a discussion with the chair of the Senate committee to let her know about this new item that was added to the bill. And I do plan to speak on it when the bill has a hearing, but I wanted to make sure that you understood exactly what the language in this amendment said, and then give you the opportunity if you have additional thoughts you'd like me to bring forward in terms of that committee meeting.
So David, is this a license for people that haven't satisfied the requirements of a permanent license? Like people right out of school, maybe?
This would be, now, this is not based on anything that I have seen in other states or for other licensing bodies. So that was one thing that I had asked when this was proposed, if there was a model that this was based on, and to my knowledge, it's not. But what the language appears to be, it appears to be under the same criteria where someone would qualify for a temporary license, where someone has met certain qualifications, but they haven't passed the licensure examination. And so they have not passed the licensure examination to have a permanent license. And so it'd be under the same criteria, aside from the additional language here that they would need to be employed at a CMHC and under the supervision of a clinical practitioner at the CMHC.
But it gives them 24 months to take the test?
Right, and I think that was similar to the new language for the temporary licenses. Currently, some of those last for 2 years or 24 months, and some last for 12 months or 1 year. And the bill does extend the time period to 24 months for each of the temporary licenses. So it would function the same amount of time as the temporary licenses.
But they would, it doesn't say they wouldn't be eligible for a temporary license if they didn't satisfy the requirements for a full license. So they essentially might have 4 years.
The language is a little, it's a little unclear on some of this. When they initially proposed it, we were uncertain if this was something they could do separately from a temporary license. But the individuals who offered it indicated that their understanding was that it would be something they could get in addition to the temporary license. But there is a lack of language on that to really clarify some of those points.
So this could be done for individuals, like for psychologists, as an example. If someone's out of postdoc, they haven't taken the EPPP, they could file for this license if they, if they worked at a CMHC, they could get this license and not have taken the EPPP, and they can hang out a shingle, so to speak, indicating that they are a licensed psychologist. Am I hearing this correctly?
Yes, I believe so. Under the language in here, and I went ahead and turned to the page on the psychology profession, it appears that as long as they work at a community mental health center, under that section C1 and under 6, or I guess number 5, that they would be under the supervision of a clinical independent level practitioner. Yes, they would be someone who either they have not taken the EPPP or they have not passed the EPPP, and they would essentially have a temporary license, but they could call themselves a psychologist and use the letters LP without having any kind of distinction that it's a temporary license or a provisional license. It would just be that they could use these initials and name just as someone who had passed the licensing examination.
And for the thing about temporary licenses, though, is that those psychologists who get a temporary license in Kansas, they have passed the EPPP.
No, not necessarily. A lot of people get the temporary in order to practice until they sit for the exam and doing their postdoc.
Okay.
I have a question. So I've really got 2 questions. One is, would the person, let's say a licensed psychologist or a psychologist who worked for a CMHC and was able to designate themselves as a licensed psychologist, are they restricted to only practice within a CMHC? Or could they work for a CMHC and then hang out a private shingle and also call themselves a licensed psychologist?
In the only direction I have on that is under C1. It says an individual may apply to the board for a community-based psychologist license to practice psychology in the scope of employment at a community mental health center. So as I read that, I would believe that they would need to be within that scope of employment at a CMHC.
And my second question, kind of in follow-up to what Leslie said, is they could do 2 years of this, calling themselves whatever profession they are as a licensed person. If they didn't pass the exam, they could then apply for a temporary license and kind of then have to designate themselves as a temporary LMSW or licensed psychologist or whatever their profession is.
And I think the language is unclear. The language of this does not say that you have to have a temporary license to go along with it. So I think if this language would go into effect, I don't see anything that would limit the person's ability to have this and then separately have the temporary license.
So they could essentially be on a temporary status for 4 years.
That's possible. You know, from a licensing board perspective, we have to sort of interpret some of this language in the light most favorable to the applicants. And nothing in this says that someone has to do them simultaneously. So I think it's a bit vague and ambiguous, but potentially that could be what would happen.
Thank you.
And the public would have no way of knowing that this person has not satisfied, that this person who under this provision has an LP, the public has no way of knowing that they've failed to meet the requirements.
I believe that's correct. Because for right now, for a temporary license, there is language that says you are not able to use the following initials unless you say the license by temporary, or, you know, they say the LP by temporary licensure, or psychologist by provisional license. There's some additional language that has to be added to it to distinguish this is different from a permanent license. But for this, the language was specifically added that they could use those terms that you would have for a permanent licensee, including both the name and also the initials.
And David, did you say that you thought that was a negotiated thing so that the CMHCs could bill for people as if they were fully licensed?
Yeah, part of the conversation that I heard, and this was an amendment that was made by a member of the committee. So, but the CMHCs were advocating for a new type of license like this. But yeah, to my understanding, this was an attempt to resolve a reimbursement issue between a couple of different agencies that don't really involve the BSRB. And so it concerns me that something like this would be added to statute to try to resolve that versus maybe those parties sitting down perhaps with the legislature and resolving that issue. And so from a public protection standpoint, it really concerns me that this could confuse the public or lead them to believe something that's not true.
At a bare minimum, I think there ought to be some additional notation to those initials that would alert the public. I mean, that to me seems the minimum. If this is inevitable, but I think having a C behind it, an LPC, well, that doesn't help. This is a mess.
Temp.
Well, I don't think it's our job to figure out what the right initials would be, but I completely agree.
Mhm.
It's just much of what we have in our professions is based on title protection. Period.
Yes.
That's it. To allow a new credential that doesn't meet the requirements to have the exact same title, it's unconscionable.
Defeats the purpose.
Yeah,
I
no,
agree, Deb.
I agree with Deb. I mean, the word unconscionable comes to mind. Like this, what we do is to protect the titles, and we're also, I mean, this board is to protect the public. And this runs afoul of what it is that we are tasked to do. It absolutely runs afoul of that. And it gets back to what Rick said. I mean, there has to be something that is put into place that at least alerts the public as to the status of this individual's license. Otherwise, what is our purpose?
Well, and David, I think you bring up a good point. And how do we look at how the system is set up that's leading to these types of recommendations versus coming at it from the opposite end? We're trying to work around a system that isn't acknowledging. And I understand the frustration and the level of advocacy that has to go into that and the barriers. But I'm not sure that this is the way to go. And I mean, workforce issues are across the board, and this is a specific entity that would be the only ones that's acknowledging these community-based licenses.
And why can't they just get a temporary license under the current regs to work?
It's the funding. It's the funding
of
the reimbursement rates are not the same for a LMSW as a LSCSW.
Right. Yeah, I knew that. But I agree, we have to protect the titles. There needs to be a designation if this were to be enacted. And they also need to strengthen the language to make it crystal clear that this license can only be used to work in a community mental health center, not to private practice. Or work in another agency, right?
The first opportunity that I'll have to address this will be in the Senate committee. And so I've had a discussion with the chair ahead of time, and I will try to meet with other members of the committee so they're familiar with some of these issues. But I wanted to make sure that you were aware of these items too. So I'll go ahead.
So Dave, during that discussion, you'll have the opportunity to let the chair know that it is really the strong preference of BSRB that this not continue in its current form and that we think, one, it does a disservice to those people who have done what they need to do to earn such a level of licensure. Plus, it makes it more difficult for us as an agency to do our primary job of protecting the public by helping them understand what it means for each of those levels of licensure and what's required of them.
And that
Yes.
it robs the public of the opportunity to understand the credentials. That, I mean, well,
This is a slippery slope. I
Mhm.
don't like anything about where this could lead us. I foresee people practicing outside of a community mental health center.
and it would be impossible to police, or next to
Right.
impossible.
I will definitely communicate the thoughts of the board on this issue and make sure that the committee is aware of the issues involved here.
Thank
you. The next amendment I want to make you aware of is it's an amendment that I put in your packet as well. This would have to do with some changes to the social work requirements for clinical licensure. And I'll go ahead and share them here on the screen. So there was an individual who presented testimony who indicated that when he had applied for licensure, he had experienced some difficulty based on what was required in another state versus what Kansas required. And some of the language addressed some of what you see in front of you in terms of different categories of education that are required for individuals that would be diagnosing and treating. And so the amendment that was made by the members of the committee essentially would decrease the number of credit hours from 15 to 3. And for individuals that currently have to have certain hours supporting diagnosis and treatment, they are required to have hours in the study of the following content areas: psychopathology, diagnostic assessment, interdisciplinary referral and collaboration, treatment approaches, and professional ethics. And the amendment that was made by the committee would strike all of those areas except for psychopathology. In item number C, it talks about the graduate level supervised clinical practicum of supervised clinical experience. Currently, it has to include psychotherapy and assessment and a number of other categories. The language there says it would be including but not limited to, and then it adds some different items. It also adds in diagnostic impressions for the practicum. And then in item D, that is the area of the statute that talks about the number of postgraduate supervised professional experience hours that are required for those clinical level practitioners. The 3,000 hours of supervised professional experience, including at least 1,500 hours of direct client contact, conducting psychotherapy and assessments, and there's some additional language there. When they passed this, Leslie and I had an opportunity to review this language. One of the major concerns that we have is under item D that talks about the 3,000 hours of supervised professional experience, including at least 1,500 hours of direct client contact, conducting psychotherapy and assessments. With the new language that says the 1,500 hours of direct client contact must include but be not limited to conducting psychotherapy and assessments. From a licensing board's perspective, in terms of enforcing that, if that language were to go into law, it appears that it would be reducing the standard from 1,500 hours of direct client contact conducting psychotherapy and assessments down to probably a standard of 1 hour. Because as long as there was some psychotherapy and assessments included in the 1,500 hours, it seems that it would meet the new standard of including but be not limited to. And I do not know if that was the intention of the individuals who made this motion and put on the amendment, but I think the effect of this language goes beyond adding additional items. And I think for the postgraduate supervision hours, it has the effect, I believe, of lowering that from 1,500 hours down to 1 hour for a standard. And Leslie, do you have any other comments on the other changes or anything else we talked about?
No, I mean, the biggest concern is the 1,500 hours.
Well, the thing that the LSCSW allows you to do is to diagnose and treat mental disorders. That's the only thing that you have to have the specialist license to do. So it makes no sense at all that you would allow other types of experience to stand in, and it's somebody who has 1,400 hours of administrative experience is in no way qualified to diagnose and treat mental disorders. So I would be wholly opposed to that amendment.
Well, and under B, it looks like they don't have to have any education in that regard either. You could spend 3 hours, you could have a 3-hour class on psychopathology and never any formal training other than 1 hour
of face-to-face contact. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I am gravely concerned, to Rick's point, about what's listed under B, especially the striking of the requirement of professional ethics. I mean, as someone who sits on the CRC, I mean, if you strike that clause, you run the risk of having individuals who can engage in all sorts of unethical conduct. And that is not something that we would want to do. And this again gets back to protecting the public. If we allow for something like this to occur, then what is our purpose?
Well, there's that, Richard, and then also the proposal to move the 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment down to 3 hours. So then that's even less.
That's post licensure.
I think to Richard's point, I think, David, this is a good opportunity to talk about the increase in the number of reports to the CRC. I realize Kansas is not unique to that, but I don't know that the legislature necessarily knows that we've seen this exponential climb in reports of unprofessional conduct and the like. And I think it's time for them to understand that. And because honestly, with this proposal and the last one, if they go forward, I can see the BSRB needing several more staff members just to keep up with the increase in complaints as we continue to water down the requirements, to do the work. And I think a parallel also in testimony is for primary care. I realize that that's also been a bit of a downward trend. However, when you go in for surgery, let's say you get your gallbladder out, you expect that person cutting you open has a baseline of experience and education. And I say we should definitely hold everyone to that same level for our mental care.
I will be addressing the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee on this item as well. I guess it's a good opportunity now too. I mentioned before the bill is tentatively scheduled for a hearing on March 21st. And sometimes they limit the amount of time individuals have to speak on bills based on how many want to speak. If any of you as board members would like to present testimony, whether written or attend the hearing,
Yes, I will.
More than welcome to do that, and I'll provide you any information you need. Some of those opportunities, you could either be in person or you could be over WebEx. They have a remote option for that too. So I'll go ahead and I will share the third amendment. And this was sort of a pretty unique amendment as well. Each of the three amendments were fairly unique. This has to do with some changes in operations for the BSRB. And so I'll go ahead and share my screen on this as well. This would essentially, instead of modifying statute, this would just add a new section to our statutes. And so essentially what this new section would do, there's two parts. The first part would say within 15 business days after receipt of an application for any license, registration, permit, or certificate issued by the BSRB, the board shall notify the applicant whether the board believes the application is complete. If the application is determined to be incomplete, the board shall notify the applicant of the information needed in order to complete the application. Once the application is deemed to be complete, the board shall complete the review of the application and issue a decision thereon within 30 business days. The second part of that would say under B1, the BSRB shall adopt rules and regulations to establish an expedited application process for any license, registration, permit, or certificate issued by the board. Upon request of the application to expedite the processing of such application and payment of the fee, the board shall complete the review of the application and issue a decision within 15 business days. And I think there was a conversation that some individuals would like the licensure process to go more quickly. I think that there is perhaps some lack of understanding in terms of why the licensure process works the way that it does. So we currently are required by law to, we cannot issue someone a license unless we show that they meet the requirements and statutes and regulations. And one of the strengths that we have in the Kansas system is that we don't have strict rules in terms of one method of licensure, or else you're not going to get licensed. Our statutes allow individuals to get already sort of an expedited processing if they attended a school that's been accredited by a national accrediting body. But we also provide alternative pathways for licensure by looking at things like substantial equivalence. However, if we come across issues when we review someone's materials, we will follow up on any red flags in terms of references. Or if we receive someone's transcripts and there are items that are missing or it's inconclusive, or if they attended a school that's not from a national accrediting program, then sometimes we will have to bring in an expert to do the review of some of those license applications. And you all know that we've worked really hard to try to ensure that we're speeding up the process. We recently have entered into contract negotiations with an outside company to do some of those educational equivalency reviews. But I think in terms of the first part of this, that talks about within 15 business days, we would let anyone who applied for licensure know if their application was complete. When someone applies for licensure, they send in certain documentation through the mail. Separately, we have a fee that is paid for the application fee. And then we receive transcripts directly from the school and frequently receive those in any variety of order. And based on reviewing that information, that's where we know if someone has a complete application or not. And what this would essentially do is it would say that we would not only have to review all that information, we would have to essentially provide sort of a judgment in terms of where they were at in the process within the 15 days. And what this appears to be is it appears to be kind of a gold standard performance goal that would be put into law. And in my research, I haven't seen a similar standard for any licensing agencies in Kansas. And I haven't seen anything like this for licensing agencies outside of the state either. I don't believe it's a bad goal to have, but right now what we tell individuals is that they should expect between 30 to 45 days after we receive a complete application. And generally, from my review of our licensing timeframes, for the vast majority of licenses, once we have everything we need, that license decision is made usually within about a week. So we really provide a fast time frame, but there are a handful of applicants where if we need to bring in an expert or we need to send additional questionnaires to the school, or in some cases, individuals don't provide what we need in a timely manner. There are some instances where individuals have met all the qualifications and they never send us their licensure fee. And we can't issue someone a license unless they have paid that to us. And so I think the complexity of the license application process is perhaps being misunderstood here. I recently presented information at a panel with the Kansas Health Institute about understanding the behavioral health workforce. And in doing that, I was able to pull some numbers. And over the last about 7 or 8 years, the population in Kansas has grown by about 1%. But during that time period, our licensees have grown by about 22%.
Wow.
And if you look at, every time we have a full board meeting, we provide information that shows the number of individuals we have at all the different levels of licensure. And I was looking at those numbers recently, and you have some of those in your packet, but basically what it shows is that when you look at the number of, let's say, our largest licensing group is social work. And for the clinical level of social work, I believe over that time period, our clinical level social workers has increased by about 40%. So we've had a lot of growth, not just in licensees, but also at the clinical level of licensees. And I believe that there may be some messages being put out there that don't really reflect that this is what's going on. A lot of the changes that the board has made over the last few years are working really well to get additional individuals into the workforce and to make sure that we are helping individuals get licensed in creative ways. But I think the problem is that if you instituted something like this, it would slow down our ability to process the different items, because right now it's kind of a juggle. We are working on lots of different permanent and temporary license applicants at the same time. But if we needed to adjust our operations to be providing this information, and it would really change a lot of things that we did. Currently, with our staffing, we wouldn't be able to do the item in new section 2, item A. We would need to probably bring in some additional staff members in terms of our licensing and also clerical. And then to that point where it says we would need to issue a decision within 30 days of a complete file, unfortunately, that probably means we would have to issue a lot more denials because we're not going to have sufficient information. Or in some cases, if we received information but they hadn't paid their fee, we would have no choice but to issue a denial in some of those cases. And so I just want to let you know that the practical effect of this, if this language would stay in, we would probably need to come to the legislature at omnibus and ask for additional expenditure authority to add more staff members to make this happen. Cynthia?
Isn't payment of the fee part, it's not complete until their application isn't complete until the fee's been paid, right?
Right.
So that 30 days wouldn't be triggered until they paid the fee.
Right. For section A, that is true. For the expedited license process in item B, nothing says that we would have to have a complete application file. So for the expedited license process, it says if you pay an additional fee at the time that you apply, the license has to be processed within 15 days, but it never says you have to have a complete file. And so in working through this, we would have to deny a lot more people for licensure. And also, I think what some people may not understand is that, last fiscal year, the board was able to, I think we had about 1,500 licenses, permanent licenses that were issued, and the board only denied about 16 of those 1,500. So we really don't deny a lot of people for licensure, but sometimes we will hold a license application to make sure we have what we need. And I think if this goes into law, what it will create is the idea that if someone pays an extra fee, they can get a fast decision. But by statute, fees paid to the board are not refundable. And so if someone pays the fee for it to be expedited and we say, we don't have enough information to say that you meet the qualifications, but we have to give you a decision because of this statutory provision, we'll be denying a lot more people after they've paid an extra fee for us to deny them quickly. And so
Dave?
I think, yes, Dave.
Given what you said, that you believe a lot of this is kind of based on bad data, people kind of, and I'm sure that, legislators only hear from people who've had difficulty getting licensed. Proactively, should we be doing more to provide data about, how quickly people are being licensed? Number one. Number two, if there are issues, and you started to kind of address this, I was wondering, with the additional requirements that are being added, given that you've already put forward the budget, you are allowed to then go back and say, okay, if this is now law, we would need additional staffing to be able to meet these new legislative criteria on the BSRB?
Yes. So when these items were amended into the bill, I provided an updated fiscal note to the Division of Budget. They provide a fiscal note on any bill that would have an effect on expenditures. And so essentially what would happen is if this bill were to pass as it is, what I estimate is that we would probably have to add about 4.5 new staff members. And I believe it would cost the agency over $300,000 in terms of the salaries and also some additional legal services. Because if we deny a lot more people, we'll need more assistance writing some of those orders to turn around the denials. So I believe that's probably what the amount would be: 4.5 FTEs and about 300,000 in additional expenditure authority. And one way that we could accomplish that in the short term is we would essentially go to the legislature when they come back for omnibus. And what happens during that process is House Appropriations and Senate Ways and Means gets updated information in terms of expenditures and estimates for revenue. And they essentially ask, are there any bills that were passed that we need to decide, should this agency receive some additional funding or should they get additional expenditure authority? And if that were to happen and the bill passed before then, we would submit something to those committees and say, based on this bill passing, we need additional funding to do this. Now we would not actually get money from them. It would be money coming from the BSRB fee fund. And while we could absorb some additional expenditures for a short time period, I think the issue is really the long-term balance. And I think some of the recent actions the board made to decrease some of the temporary license fees, I think the board would probably need to revisit if they still want to decrease fees or if they want to, potentially look at increasing fees to kind of level out some of these new expenses.
It wouldn't be just temporary ones, would it? Because there was recent reductions in permanent license fees as well that might need to be reversed.
The renewals and the applications were lowered and they would need to go back up probably.
Yeah. So $300,000 a year, it sounds like that would put us underwater in what, 2 years, 2.5?
Well, so it's complicated.
Yeah.
One thing right now, there's a number of multi-state compacts that are going around that could really change the way that we receive revenue from licensees. And we have about $2.2 million in the fee fund right now, and our expenditures each year have been around $1 million. So in the short term, I believe we could absorb a little bit of this, but we are essentially, prior to this past year, we have been operating at a deficit based on some of those fee decreases the board had put into effect back in 2019. So I think we really would need to look at reversing some of those, at least in part. And then the recent action the board took to reduce the temporary license fees, I think they would also need to revisit to make sure that we don't decrease too quickly because of some of these things.
The deficit, Dave, was purposeful, right? I mean, we knew that because we were trying to spend down some of what we had. But I do think it's really important that as a board, we begin to review kind of how quickly people are getting licensed so that it stays on our radar and we can then respond to these kind of issues with, we're looking at this month to month and really keeping a close eye on it and responding to it appropriately, because I know the vast majority of calls I get are from people who are saying, I'm having trouble getting my license in a timely fashion. So I'm sure legislators are hearing the same thing.
But isn't that somewhat of a moot point in that people can be hired and work while their application for licensure is pending? So, framing this as the way to solve workforce issues seems misguided. It doesn't seem like it's a serious problem in terms of the numbers of people that are not able to work in their field because they can't get licensed in what they consider a timely fashion. Would you agree with that, Leslie and Dave?
I was going to say, standard review of applications, the people that have to wait, the people that have trouble getting licensed, didn't go to a professionally accredited program. They didn't have the proper coursework, or they have any of the items listed in the statute where the board has to approve or deny their license. Staff can't do that. So, yeah, it wouldn't, I don't think it would make a big difference. We would just have to deny them instead of continuing the review for a longer process.
Well, and there's also some, I believe that there are probably some legal factors in here too. Because there are certain applicants based on, any felonies or past conduct that are required by law. If they're going to be licensed, you have to have a 2/3 vote of the board.
Mhm.
But based on this 15-day expedited timeframe, if somebody fell into that category and we were not scheduled to have a meeting of the board to review that individual's application, I don't know what we would be able to do in that situation, except we would have to deny them.
So that gets to a question that I had, like, this would affect the CAPA process, right? Like, it would affect the number of meetings potentially that we would need to have to address the concerns that you just mentioned, which would then potentially affect the fiscal note that would be submitted to the legislature. So I'm wondering if in the revision of the fiscal note that you described earlier, David, if the note addressed came into board members as an example to address this matter in particular, because I think this affects the CAPA process.
Yeah, and I can genuinely say, based on what I've heard from other licensing boards, you guys are a very active board. And I really appreciate that. I know Leslie does as well. You meet for full board meetings every other month. You have a standard CAPA meeting at the end of each month. You attend the advisory committees, you have license hearings, you have special meetings when we have things like legislation that comes up for your review. And so you all meet frequently. And so the idea of asking you to essentially meet anytime we had one of these with a short time frame, I think would probably be unreasonable for us to ask you all to do. So I think it would put us into a very difficult position for some of these reviews, if it didn't fall in the right time period. And then also, in looking at this language, it says the board would have to issue a decision. When we deny someone for licensure, there is a legal order that is drafted that explains the facts in the situation. It talks about the legal analysis, the reason for the decision, and those things can't be generated overnight. But essentially, the idea that you could do all of this in that short of a time frame is really unreasonable. And I think it would give people a false impression that they would be able to just, get quicker service, when I think the problem is we would be collecting a lot of fees for individuals that we wouldn't be able to get licensed. And I think the real shame is that if we had additional time, we probably would be able to license a vast majority of these individuals, but they would think, well, you have everything you need, I just want to license fast. And that's just not how the licensure process works. We have to make sure we have what we need. Otherwise, we have no choice but to deny someone a license.
And then they have to pay and reapply if they want to get licensed. So it essentially doubles their hassle factor.
And I think it's important too that we talk about really some of the reasons why some of this may take longer for certain individuals. When we talked about needing experts and that kind of thing, but also, just when someone is trying to pass the licensure examination, they schedule that licensing examination with a company and they may have passed, but until we have their score reported to us from the licensing test givers, we are not able to accept it directly from the applicant. We have to have it from the official source. And so there can be a delay sometimes. We don't have the ability to compel those groups to provide it to us any quicker. But I think that's one of the things that some people may not understand, is that there are these time periods that we have no control over, but once we get the information, we're able to act on it. And so I think some people just think, all the information comes in at once and we have a stack of these applications and these files that are just ready. And if they could just move theirs to the front of the line, we could just go ahead and get them licensed. And the majority of the time that is nowhere close to the truth. Really, it's that we receive a few pieces from this person, a few pieces from that person, and we are tracking when items are received. And then once we get the final piece, then we can go ahead and make the decision or bring it to the board so the board can make the decision. So really just kind of walk through some of these things for you all too.
And when we receive an application that has all the necessary forms, that doesn't mean the forms are correct. people send in references that aren't acceptable. They don't put their coursework, they don't list their coursework, they don't, there's all kinds of things that can be wrong in the application. The applicant themselves miss questions. I mean, it's just, human nature. So there's, just because we have everything even doesn't mean it can be that speedy. We have to go back and forth with the references. They don't always answer, or they don't answer right away. They're all busy individuals working, and so there are a lot of things that, can slow things down.
Well, I think that the thing that you stress to the committee then is that all this means is that those people that have been complaining the most will get rejected more quickly. Right.
Yeah.
And it will cost more for the state. There will be a higher rejection rate, and ultimately this is going to hurt the workforce imbalance that we've already got. Yeah.
In addition, I think to providing the data you have about how many of those people do get processed as quickly as you said, because if they're living with information that really leads them to believe that for most people, this process is really slow, helping them to understand both what Rick said, but also that the vast majority of people are moving through that more quickly than they believe, and that if we put this on our agenda to be reviewing and looking for ways to make sure we're doing that as efficiently as possible, and if we need to add staff, so be it, as long as the budget's willing, they're willing to allow us to increase the budget to accommodate that, then I'm certainly fine if there's an issue we can address through staffing.
Dave, in my mind, when you say that, I'm imagining a table that shows, this many applications were processed within this period of time, and that outside of that window, we've got the people who came from unaccredited programs, right, or had other kinds of issues, and then outside of that, people with felonies. Do you really want us to move these people, in here without a proper review? And so even, I don't know if that kind of table could exist on the time frame, but I think it's a good idea, Dave.
I've started to pull some of the data. We work with an agency that hosts our licensing system, and their ability to pull numbers for some of these things is a little limited, but they have started to provide some of that information to me, and I've started to try to break it down to kind of give a range about how many individuals are licensed within a certain amount of time. And so we're working on that, and hopefully we'll have some of that a little bit more for you in the future, so you can kind of see, because I understand, there may be a handful of individuals, but they are vocal individuals, and it can give an impression that it's just taking a long time for everyone, but there's a myriad of factors, and we'll bring back some information for you so you can kind of see the timeframes, knowing that there are going to be certain factors that maybe are outside of our control as a licensing body, such as if a school doesn't respond with information, or the person themselves doesn't respond back with something we need. But we'll try to give you some information you can look at in the future.
I think that number you gave of only 16 that were actually ultimately denied would be really important to include when you're having that conversation. Taking longer to get licensed, but ultimately getting licensed and being able to practice while you're awaiting licensure, that isn't really a problem for workforce strength.
I'm sorry, Cynthia, but when you talk about working before they get their license, are you referring to them like practicing social work?
Well, I mean, like in an agency. I mean, when they can hire people, and while they're still getting in the process of getting licensed, right? And they're allowed to work while their license is being considered. We had an applicant a while back where that was an issue, that he had worked beyond the time that he'd been denied.
He actually worked without a temporary license. They cannot practice their profession unless they get a temporary license, and they can't have that until they've been approved. So that they can't practice social work or addiction counseling or professional counseling until they have a license. They can do other things, but they can't.
Right. So for clarification, agencies may hire people while they're waiting to get licensed, and they may be going through an orientation or doing, but they can't, as Leslie said, they can't practice.
Okay, I misunderstood that. Thank you.
Jim, welcome.
Yeah, and there are certain exceptions if you are a student. There are certain things that you can do under a student exception. And then there are also, I've seen some employers who may hire someone to do a position that does not require licensure, and then hoping to move them over to a scope of practice that would require licensure once the person becomes licensed. So we've seen some things like that, but and we really do want to do what we can to help out with the licensure process. We put in things that try to make the process faster. And we're not opposed to that. We do have a little bit of limitation in terms of physical space here in the building. But I've set up a meeting with someone who works in facilities who I'll be meeting with her tomorrow just to get an idea if there's some additional storage area here in the building that might give us the option to free up a little bit of space if we did need to expand our staffing. So we're trying to approach this from different angles, but also want to make sure that good information is being put out there as well. So. But like I mentioned, these amendments are currently on the bill. The bill is up for a hearing tentatively on Tuesday, March 21st, in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. So if any of you are interested in observing that meeting, I think it would be really helpful to see the interactions and the conversation. And if you would like to present testimony, just keep in mind, you're not able to present testimony on behalf of the entire board, but in your role as a board member, you can definitely present information to the committee in terms of your testimony to kind of speak from your expertise or to any of the items that the board has officially taken a position on to discuss. And the board has provided to me the ability to speak on behalf of the board when I'm presenting testimony. But I think it could be helpful for the committee to really hear from you all in your role, just to have a better understanding of maybe why some of these issues are complicated or why some of the concerns are as significant as they are. So I'll go ahead and just summarize a few more things as part of my report. There are a number of bills that would affect the BSRB that are currently being discussed, but a number of those have died because of a process called turnaround, when the legislature has to shift from considering bills in their own chamber to the bills in the other chamber for the most part. There is a recent bill that was brought forward that has to do with providing electronic credentials for licensing in addition to paper credentials. And that bill has been modified a few different times. There's been a number of confusion, but one of the items in that bill would be to try to have a centralized reporting location for credentials of licensing bodies. And so the way the bill is currently worded, it would not require agencies to become part of a unified licensing system, but it would require agencies to provide information on who has a credential and any changes to those licenses or credentials. And that would begin as of January 1st of 2025. It is still well away from passing, but it is being discussed, and there's been a number of questions and some confusion about it. So I'll continue to monitor that bill. For the BSRB, I don't think it would have a great effect since it's been modified, but I'll keep you aware of that. In your packet, there is some information on an update from Jason Hess on the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. He does serve as the board's appointee to that board, and that board has recently met twice, and they've agreed to release 2 RFPs. The copy of the RFP is included in that update, which is in your packet. Additionally, we spoke previously about a social work multi-state compact. The drafters were still working on that compact when we last spoke. They have met in February and finalized the language. So it is probably too late in the legislative session for that to come before the legislature this year, but it is likely or possible that it could come before the Kansas legislature next year. And the language on that compact can be found at swcompact.org. And additionally, I wanted to let you know, I talked to you before about some federal SPARK funding related to the pandemic that was made available to agencies for modernization purposes. I applied for some grant funding for that for 2 items. It's just some technology to be replaced here at the BSRB office, including a camera and a projector. And I was approved for grant funding for that. So we were able to get about $2,280 in grant funding. So we'll be receiving that from the SPARK fund here soon. And then in my report, I also provided a few different meetings that we had recently spoken at, Leslie and myself, in terms of speaking to groups of students. I mentioned that I had spoken as part of a panel at KNI. And also there've been a number of different legislative meetings that I've attended or presented testimony on. There is one bill that includes some of the language from the BSRB bill, that's House Bill 2375, that would create the temporary candidacy bachelor's and master's level social work licenses. It also has some additional language that directs that it's going to work for programs that are in person, but also online programs. And that that bill has passed the House, and it is going to be heard this afternoon at 1:30 in the Senate Education Committee. So I'll be providing testimony in support of that bill later on today. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and stand for any questions.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate that. Any questions or comments from the board? All right, we'll move on to staff reports.
I don't have anything.
Okay, and we just wanted to highlight, we have the historic numbers on licensees that are in your packet. So feel free to review those and let us know if you have any questions.
Good, thank you. We'll move on to the complaint review committee report. Who will be providing that?
That will be Cindy, who will be speaking to the CRC.
Hi, Cindy.
Hello. At the end of February 2023, we had 130 complaints. At this point in fiscal year 2022, we had 115 complaints. So I believe that puts us on track to have at least as many complaints as we did last fiscal year, which was 205. If you look at the February cases reviewed by the Complaint Review Committee, there were 7 cases that were tabled. I wanted to let you know that this was due to a large number of cases that we received, some of which were very complex.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions for Cindy? Or any other comments from members of the complaint review committee? Okay, thank you. We'll move on then to professions reports, licensed psychology.
Yes, we met on February 7th of this year. We had a continued discussion of the education regulation 102-1-12. We also had a conversation about the EPPP2 moving into eventually moving into a required status for all licensed psychologists at the doctoral level. Us currently it's recommended by ASPPB, but we don't have to use EPPP2. At some point that will roll into the required. We won't be able to use EPPP1 without using EPPP2, which is going to be interesting. We had a conversation about adding new advisory board members, and I understand that we have received a number of applications for that we will address at some point. And we did board and advisory committee training on CORA, COMA, and CAPA. That was our meeting.
Thank you, Rick. Social work.
We had to cancel our meeting and have not yet rescheduled it. So, but we'll be continuing our discussion about the compact and about the data that was released about the exam at our next meeting.
Very good, Cynthia. Thank you.
Mhm.
Professional counseling.
So I'll go ahead and carry with that report. Professional Counseling Advisory Committee did meet at the beginning of February. One of the major items was training for board members and also advisory committee members. And the committee will be meeting again in April.
Dave. Mesh level psychology did not meet in February. Marriage and family therapy.
And Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee also did not meet in February, but we'll be meeting again in April.
Thank you. Addiction counseling.
Yes, the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee met on March 3rd, and several of the items that we took up are actually in our agenda today, which included a new appointment to the committee, as well as consideration of an accrediting body to put into regulation. And then the other thing we really, oh, I'm sorry, there's also changes to the education regs that are also on the agenda that we would like to discuss. And then we discussed future topics that we might consider this year, including just further examination of reciprocity, whether we want to consider practice as well as education for those that have been in the field for a long time coming from other states. So that, and then we meet again on June 2nd.
Thank you, Deb. The Behavior Analyst Group met on January 9th, finalized their recommendation for changes to unprofessional conduct, had a discussion of the care of clients in crisis, and a discussion on possible reinstatement statutes. We were scheduled to meet in February, and that was canceled, so I believe we're looking for a date in March or April. We are now scheduled for a 10-minute break. Let's see. How about 11:50? Does that work? All right. See you in a few minutes. We're just waiting on a couple of folks. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you, Dave.
Okay. Everything froze for a second. Okay. All right, we're ready to get back to our agenda. Dave, where do we want to discuss the request from Deborah Ramberg? We had indicated we would wait till Jim joined.
Yeah, I think on that item, if it's okay with the board, I just want to look into the details of that a little bit more, possibly research what effect a letter from the board might have on that issue. So if it's okay with you, I think it might be a good idea for us to just postpone consideration of that until a future meeting, just to make sure that we're doing things the right way on this one.
I'm certainly okay with that. I was resistant to wanting to weigh in on that. Everybody else okay with waiting?
I'm okay. I'm just mindful of their timeframes, which might
Right.
suggest that letter is moot if we wait too long, like if we wait till the next board meeting. So just saying, perhaps we might need to meet ahead of that. We might have needed to anyway for legislative reasons. So
Well, let me ask this question, because it really only matters if people think that the board should weigh in on this. If we think we should, then it makes sense for Dave to look at what the repercussions of that might be. If we don't think the board should weigh in, then we can make that decision now. And personally, it seems like an issue from my perspective that seems odd for us to weigh in on. And I'm not sure what if we do for this, if our other groups going to come forward in other situations, which is really kind of outside our scope. Cynthia?
So there's a statement of fact that that licensure is the highest level of licensure. Whether that the school district should be paying them a certain rate, I just, that's none of my, I want them to get as much money as they can. I just don't know that that part feels like it's outside the scope of, so if they're asking for a statement, is that the highest level of licensure? Sure, we can provide that statement because that's accurate. But beyond that, I don't know. It just seems a little like you, Dave. I don't know exactly what they're needing from us.
Sounds like they want us to say that it's equivalent to a doctoral level. And that's where it gets kind of problematic for me.
Yeah, I don't think we have any grounds or call to comment on their salary structures, but certainly confirming that the LSCSW is the highest level and confirming the hours and the requirements of that degree. I think is something that, again, is just a statement of fact, but might be useful to her in going to her vice president, was it, or vice principal? Forget, or
The
superintendent.
Superintendent.
Right, deputy superintendent, I was a school social worker for 5 years, and the people who did the testing for us, our learning specialists, I think they were educational psychologists. And help me understand, is an educational psychologist able to diagnose and treat mental disorders?
So school psychologists are different from clinical psychologists.
Right.
They're not, and Rick, tell me, say something if I misspeak here. They're not licensed in the same way that we are licensed, and they cannot provide the same sort of diagnosing and assessment that a clinical psychologist or an LP can provide.
Or clinical social worker.
It's right. So there's two different accrediting bodies, right? For the school psychologist, there's NASP, and then but a school program could be accredited by APA, and some are accredited by both. Someone who graduates from an APA accredited school psychology doctoral program could get licensed as an LP, just like you and me. But if they're from an NASP program, it's a different thing entirely. So it's complicated.
So
Well, my point was that
before we get too far in the weeds, it really comes down to this. If we want to send any kind of response, it makes sense that Dave have opportunity to kind of do a little research into that. If we just are going to say this isn't something we feel like we should weigh in on, then we can do that right now. So what I'm asking for from you all is, do you want to postpone this and let Dave do a little research? Or do we want to weigh in and say, we think this is really not within our scope?
I'm fine with postponing it and let Dave research.
likewise.
Consensus?
I don't see any harm in letting Dave, I think whatever he finds could have implications for other requests like this. I guess I'll be surprised if I change my mind that I think we should weigh in on this, so.
Very good. And we will wait until a future meeting to discuss this further. Thank you. On to old business, Dave.
Okay, so the first item up is the proposed changes to the unprofessional conduct regulations by the advisory committees. And we've had, as you heard, a number of the advisory committees were canceled this past month because of a number of legislative hearings that were scheduled on dates that we already had meetings scheduled. And so there are still a few advisory committees that are working to finalize their recommendations on unprofessional conduct. So this is more or less just a placeholder to make sure we keep this on the radar. We'll circle back around to it at a future board meeting, but I just want to give you an update on where we're at with that. And then we'll bring back those recommendations at a future board meeting for you all to review.
Good, thank you. New business?
So the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee had opened up the process to consider new members for the advisory committee. And at the last meeting, the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee did recommend to the chair of the board appointing a new member, and that is Zenova Williams. And so I had spoken with the board chair, Mary Jones, and she was supportive of going ahead and appointing her, but unfortunately, Mary couldn't be here at the meeting today.
Is that something I can do in her stead?
Yes, you would be able to do that.
Well, then consider it done.
Thank you, David.
I'll just note that David never broke a sweat.
Moving on to appointment of board members to hearing panel.
Yes, so in the fall, we began a process by which we have board members serving on hearing panels when an applicant who's been denied for licensure requests a hearing. There has been an individual who recently requested a hearing. It's for a licensed professional counselor license. And so you may recall the criteria we were looking for when one of those individuals applies for a hearing is that it would be a 5-member hearing panel of the board. There would be the board member for that profession, also at least one public member. And so the individuals for this hearing panel, I will phrase it this way: would a board member like to make a motion to appoint the following members to a hearing panel? Dave Anderson, Laura Shaughnessy, Jackie Lightcap, Cynthia Schindel, and Jana Norton.
So moved to appoint those individuals to a hearing panel.
Second.
Very good. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Thank you. Next item, technical modification to advisory committee policy to reflect change in legal counsel.
Okay, and so in your packet, you have a copy of the advisory committee policy. There is one technical change under the structure of the committee. There was previous language in the policy that mentioned the assistant attorney general representing the board should attend the meetings when their attendance is requested. And we have moved away from legal counsel from the attorney general's office. So this would just be a technical change to replace that terminology with legal counsel representing the board should attend the meetings when their assistance is requested. I suppose I would be looking for a motion to adopt that change.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Thank you. Next, we have board consideration of a regulation change for the addiction counseling.
And actually, Dave, there's one item in D in between there.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the requirement for educational equivalency review.
Yes, so currently right now, we talked a little bit about the process by which individuals can qualify for licensure. And for individuals who went to a program that's not accredited by the national accrediting body, there is an educational equivalency process they can go through, and it involves them coming from a program that meets certain requirements and regulation. And one of the items that we have been discussing internally at the BSRB office recently is that when we are trying to make that determination if the program meets the educational equivalency standards, we send a questionnaire that is modeled after the regulations, which essentially says, does your program do X, Y, Z? And they have to answer yes or no and provide supporting documentation. However, it assumes, based on the wording of that, that this is a point in time response. And we know that individuals who went to that program, sometimes those programs can take several years. And so we want to be able to make sure we're being consistent with all applicants for licensure and being fair to individuals. And I believe, I'm not sure we had discussed this in the past, but one thing we wanted to bring to the board to make sure we have on record is what we would like to do is change the phrasing of the questionnaire so that it says for the majority of the time that the individual attended that program, did the program X, Y, Z. And we think this could be helpful because, as I mentioned, the individual attended those programs for several years, and there could be periods of time, let's say briefly, where the chair was replaced and it wasn't a person who met the qualifications and the regulations, but for the majority of time the individual was there, it did meet the program requirements. Or let's say the ratio of core faculty to adjunct faculty was consistent 90% of the way through, but they had some unexpected departures. And so for a brief period of time, they had perhaps more adjuncts than core faculty. But I think if we used a consistent standard, we said for the majority of the time the individual attended that program, did it meet the requirements and regulation, and then list those out, I think it would be more fair to the individuals applying for licensure, and it would be a consistent standard we could apply to individuals. We would need to modify our questionnaire, but I wanted to bring it before you to see if you were in support of making that change. This would not require. Oh, sorry, Cynthia.
The majority would be defined as 50% or higher, 51% or higher.
Yes, we could define it that way. This was something that would not need to actually change the regulations or the statutes. It would really just be an interpretation from the licensing body. But we wanted to make sure that you were all aware of this change and that if you were in favor of it, we could modify our questionnaires. And so, but it would go from a standard of, instead of asking at a specific point in time, it really was more fair to over the course of the time they were at that program.
Additional questions or comments?
Would this apply to all of the questions that are on the questionnaire?
I believe it would.
Okay.
Sounds fair to me. I would agree with it.
As this is a simply going to impact how staff interpret it, do you need a motion for that or just a consensus?
I think if it's just consensus, that would be fine. This would not need to be something that would officially need to change the statutes or regulation, but wanted to bring it to your attention because we wanted to modify those questionnaires, but wanted to make sure you were aware of this sort of change in interpretation as we go through. But I think it will allow us to license some individuals a little more quickly while still going with the intent of the regulation, I believe.
Okay. Everybody okay with that? Nodding of the head, thumbs up, very good. Looks like we have a consensus, thank you. Okay, that takes us to board consideration of regulation changes for addiction counseling.
Okay, and I will share my screen here. The Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee met recently and recommended some changes to the educational requirements and regulation for the profession. This is KAR 102-7-3. And one of the items that and Deb, feel free to jump in if you would like to speak to any of these items specifically as well. Some of these changes are already in the course of going through, so that's why you see some different markups. But we highlighted the items that were the most recent changes. And so one item is the advisory committee had spoken recently to a national accrediting body for addiction counseling. Addiction counseling is one of two of the professions for the BSRB that does not currently recognize an accrediting body, but individuals from NASAC, the National Addiction Studies Accrediting Commission, or Accreditation Commission, presented information to the advisory committee, and the advisory committee had an opportunity to ask questions, do further research, and their recommendation at the most recent meeting was to recommend including this as a method to qualify for licensure, that if a program is accredited by NASAC, then it would satisfy the educational requirement for the individual applicants. Now, it would not make all applicants have to meet this standard. What it would do it would say those individuals who applied for licensure could either come from a program that's accredited by NASAC or could meet the requirements that we already had in regulation for those individual applicants. So just add another pathway for individuals to meet those requirements. And so it's, yes, Dave?
Quick question. So how close are their requirements to our current requirements?
And I'm not sure I could really comment too closely on that. There were members of the advisory committee that did review to check to see how similar they were, and there was discussions about that, but I'm not sure I could really comment on that today.
Yeah, it was very clear to me, and unfortunately, we only have one educator now on the committee, and that was another reason we wanted to appoint Zenova. But you know, he's planning on pursuing this accreditation for his own program. So I do think they are equivalent. And this accrediting body is kind of a offshoot of NADAC, National Association of Addiction, Drug and Alcohol Counselors, something like that. Been around a very, very long time, predates most laws in most states for licensure for addiction counseling. So yeah.
Thank you.
There was some information that was brought forward during the presentations that discussed that they do have credit programs in a number of different states, and they do have credit programs at different levels. And I believe that there were a couple of programs they credit that are online only programs. So I know that is something as well that it's a small number of programs that are online only, but that was some of the groups that were in the mix that they accredit for.
That I would add though that practicum 1 and practicum 2 are part of the standard requirements, and if those are done in person, then they meet the in-residence requirements, so it probably wouldn't affect them in that big of a way.
There was some additional recommendations the advisory committee had forwarded. One was a change to certain coursework that is defined within the regulation. One was on methods of individual counseling. And so the change that was made here was to remove the term substance use and instead replace that with biopsychosocial needs.
Can I ask about the rationale for that? Why wouldn't you have both? I mean, it's an addictions counseling degree.
Yeah. So the context for all of this, as we were looking at those temporary levels of licensures for students, I started looking at the coursework, having conversations with staff about what, or if any of these coursework is kind of keeping people out that are coming from other disciplines. Addiction counseling just continues to struggle in a way because we don't have these widespread national accrediting, bodies that are adopted by colleges and universities. So from the very beginning, the state, BSRB, had to create some specificity in our language to speak to the work. But we've always tried to straddle the line of being a bit general so that as many people within reason could, fit the requirements. So just over time, as you look at some of these things, I thought it was curious that group counseling didn't speak to substance use at all. But it does for individual counseling. So we had a long discussion about this. And honestly, at the end of the day, it was seen as best to reflect the field where it is now, right? So when these were written, everything was still very siloed and we tended to think in siloed terms. But now we are looking at people more holistically. We're wanting people to have some training in these various things. And at the end of the day, also, this was one of the ways that by default, some of the educators had decided to address assessment, which is addressed later, but they can't diagnose, and LAC cannot diagnose. So that seemed to be a bit prescriptive for something they weren't going to do in, quote, real life.
So this would remove the requirement that they have training in individual counseling that would include assessing substance use.
It would just make more courses from other disciplines.
Count.
It'd be, yes.
Okay.
Without having to go back and take another course that someone is offering that specifically calls out substance use.
Okay. Thank you.
So that's kind of the context for the other one too that we'll talk about here in a minute.
Go ahead and move to item number 8. Family and community studies, which shall include the study of family, social, and community systems. And the language that was struck was the impact of addiction on family and society, and then the development of culturally informed skills utilized in the treatment and recovery process.
This was also similar thinking. We don't expect LACs to basically do family therapy. We do want them to understand the context around family. As I reflected on the kinds of things we have our LACs doing, the things I did as a beginning counselor, this is a training issue for that level. It's gonna be by experience. You're gonna teach them basically what they need to know. These are not people that can practice independently. They can't diagnose. So there's no danger of them really wading into these waters being completely unprepared. But again, many different disciplines offer these kinds of courses, which would then count for someone who's coming from a different area or hadn't intended on getting into addiction counseling.
And the other modifications to that document are really just repeated references to the national accrediting body, but making sure that it is clear for the different levels of licensure that it would essentially be another method that individuals could use to meet the educational criteria when they apply for licensure.
I just want to mention, since we're not going through the entire list of education regs, there's still several courses that are very addiction specific that they just could not possibly, probably anyway, get from any other track or program that isn't really looking at addiction specific counseling.
Yeah, and to your point, number one has to do with the introduction to addiction, and it goes into that. Number 4 has to do with addiction pharmacology, and so.
There's also one on co-occurring disorders, which we discussed at length and just chose to leave alone.
So I think the question would be, if the board is willing to do so, would there be a motion to modify the regulations to make the adjustments to the 2 courses that were mentioned, and also to add recognition of the national accrediting body to meet the educational standards for licensure?
So moved.
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thank you. Was that both 1 and 2, Dave, or do we need to move to 2?
That covers both 1 and 2. 1 was a recognition of the new accrediting body, and then number 2 were the other coursework requirements and regulations. So that satisfies both I and II.
Very good. So that moves us to the board discussion on KAR 102-2-12.
Yes, and I'll go ahead and share my screen on that item as well. So this is a regulation for the social work profession. Leslie and I have had some discussions internally. We've had some individuals. This would be for the social work profession, KAR 102-2-12, for individuals seeking licensure as a clinical level social worker. And specifically under C, it indicates that each applicant for licensure as a specialist clinical social worker shall meet the following requirements. And in number 2, it says complete in not less than 2 years and not more than 6 years, at least 3,000 hours of satisfactorily evaluated postgraduate supervised clinical social work practice. The not less than 2 years is pretty standard language between the professions. But the social work profession, I believe, is the only profession that has the language that says not more than 6 years. And Leslie, can you comment a little on what you've seen from applicants on that?
Yes, so the not more than 6 is only for social work, and we have had many contacts with social workers who, couldn't practice during COVID. So they're running out of time. They did most of their hours in the beginning, and if they get to that 6-year mark, the beginning hours start to drop off. Also, that's only for the hours. When someone applies for an LSCSW, if they completed their hours 20 years ago within 6 years, they can still apply for their LSCSW using those hours and pass the exam and get a license. So the 2 to 6 does not mean they have to have a license as an LSCSW. It just means they have to finish the hours. And that has come up a lot lately. We've had people who had cancer, COVID, many different things that are struggling to meet that 6-year requirement.
So I guess we wanted to highlight this for the board. It's not in statute, it's only in regulation in terms of the not more than 6 years. But we wanted to bring it to your attention because we do strive to have consistency in the regulations when we can, if there are different processes that are similar. And so understanding that some applicants have had issues with this and it will impact individuals' ability to get licensed, we wanted to bring it to your attention and allow you to have some discussion on this.
Do we know the rationale behind having a 6-year ceiling, what that was in the first place?
I do not. It has been there. I don't know the rationale.
I think it was probably a thought that you needed, your concentrated experience, if you will, to build your skills to a level. 6 years is still pretty spread out to get those number of hours.
Mhm.
But those situations you're describing, Leslie, it makes sense that we need to have some ability to extend that. Or how often has it happened that you've gotten somebody who did their hours 20 years ago and is now coming forward for licensure? Because I would be concerned about that, because what were they doing between year 6 and year 20? And, if your clinical experience was 20 years ago, I'm not sure you're really ready to go out and practice independently now if you haven't been practicing in the interim.
Right. I can't say how often it happens. I mean, Joan doesn't tell me all the time, but they have where they've taken off to raise their kids. They never got their clinical license. They completed their hours. That's a big, one of the, I guess, larger reasons that we've seen. But I don't know how often it happens, but it does happen.
With adding language that said something about extenuating circumstance, which would allow for those people, COVID or people who are getting treatment for a significant disease, some leeway. I kind of agree with Cynthia in terms of if they just didn't do it, that's one thing versus something significantly occurring in their life that prevented them from doing it.
If this is just in regulation, can it be that we could ask the staff to bring this to us if it occurs, and we can make an exception or determine at that point whether an exception should be made? Or do you just want, or is blanket changing the regulation the only way to go?
Well, and from my reading of this, it doesn't really seem to have language that allows a lot of flexibility. And so I'm not sure, you want to make sure that you're following the law, whether it's in statute or regulation. I do think to the other point of if you wanted to add language about this would be the standard unless there was extenuating circumstances, I think that would provide the flexibility that you're kind of talking about.
And people in other professions do take longer than 6 years to complete their hours as well. I mean, it's not just social work that it happens to. It does happen in other professions.
I'm fine with adding the language necessary to allow flexibility.
I would agree with that.
Is that the consensus of the group? And I cannot see you all, so chime in, if you will.
So I just need clarification. We're removing the 6-year requirement?
No,
No,
adding extenuating circumstances approved by the board, that it can go over 6 years. if there's extenuating circumstances.
But social work is the only one that has that limitation.
Yes.
If I had my druthers, I would, kind of getting back to the original point, I would like to see there be parallel language between the professions. And I'm not gonna stop the board from going in the direction that we're going. I just would, consider that we have language inserted potentially, that there be a cap, but then you get into, well, what's an appropriate cap for the different professions? So that's something that I would consider, but I'm not going to vote in a way that would be in the negative in terms of where we're going.
So all the professions have the same requirements for all the master's level, except behavior analysts. The 3,000 hours with 1,500 direct client contact and 100 hours of supervision is the same for all of the master's professions moving toward clinical license.
Then it has to be not less than 2 years, right?
Right, they all say it has to be not less than 2 years, but the rest, that's it. They don't have.
But none of them say in no more than 6,
Correct,
with the exception of this license.
right.
Okay.
So would the board prefer to then just remove that and have all of the professions be the same?
I would prefer they be the same.
Other folks?
I think that's what we've been trying to move towards. I guess I would ask the other professions if they've seen any concerns with not having a cap, and I would wonder how social work got that, but I think that was asked already.
Yeah,
I think
don't
that
know
was
how they
there
got
from the, I think that was there from the very first when it was first put into statute, is my memory. I may be wrong about that, Leslie.
I don't know. It's been there as long as I've been here.
Going to a point that was made earlier, it would seem that a psychologist who hasn't practiced for 10 years, they'd be in the same boat as a clinician, a social worker. So I don't really see the difference. And if there hasn't been any concerns, then I would be open to having it match the language across the board.
Is there a consensus on that? I see a few heads.
So the question that's put in front of the board is which question now, Dave?
Should we change the current social work reg to be in alignment with the other professions, in that it not have an upper limit in terms of the number of years? Is that correct? All right. Thumbs up, head nodding. Looks like we have a consensus. Thank you.
Remove that 6-year cap.
That takes us to discussion on types of changes necessary to be reported for clinical training plans.
And I'll share my screen as an example. This is just one profession, but there's pretty consistent language between the different professions. So for individuals who have a clinical training plan that is approved, there is language in the regulation. I'll go ahead and I'll pull up the language here for the social work profession. It's 102-2-8 for supervision. And at the very end of that regulation, what it says is All changes to the clinical supervision training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. These changes shall be submitted no more than 45 days after the date on which the changes took effect. If the supervisee fails to submit the change to the board within that 45-day period, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan are approved by the board. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this to the board is because from time to time, there have been questions about if something is really a change or if something is a substantial enough change. And I think there may be some questions from individuals providing the supervision. There may be some questions from applicants. And, in certain situations, if they don't submit the change within a certain amount of time, they could lose a lot of the hours that they had accrued. And from a licensing board perspective, we want to make sure that individuals know what the expectation is. And we also want to make sure that we're enforcing things consistently. So this was an item we wanted to highlight for you today, not necessarily to go in depth and have a discussion today, but we thought this could be a good item to maybe refer to the advisory committees, that you could have a discussion about the types of changes you thought would be helpful. And perhaps the board could design some language in here that would really point to certain things that for sure would be the types of changes that would need to be identified. For example, if you changed supervisors, or if you changed location, or going into some of the details like that, we think it would be helpful for everybody involved, provide more kind of clarity, and then hopefully you wouldn't have individuals that fell into an issue where they would have to have some of their hours taken away when they submit their hours. So just wanted to highlight for you today, and then ask if you could go ahead and plan to talk to your advisory committees about this, and see if you could have a discussion about maybe some specific changes that should be added to the regulation to provide a little bit more clarity and transparency for applicants.
Dave, would it be possible if staff have some specific thoughts about that they could provide that as a starting point for advisory boards?
I can tell you that it has been all changes. Staff has looked at it, and if they didn't submit a change, any change, moving up in changing positions at your place of employment when you stay in the same agency, that's considered a change. So it would really be just deciding what the professions felt was most important.
But I think,
yeah, my question was really, are there things that you think meet a threshold that would require reporting to BSRB versus one that would not?
I think we could talk internally and try to put down a few bulleted list items. And then that way the advisory committees could use that as sort of a starting point. And then perhaps we could even have something that says what would not qualify as a real change. And so I think this could be helpful for everybody involved. And so we can have some discussion here, and then start off with the list, and then provide that to the advisory committees, and then we could go from there.
Great.
I think that it would be
helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be especially helpful to have some considerations put forward in terms of changes that would not necessarily meet a threshold for the submission of something to us, because there have been some things that have come to us where it's like, yeah, you really needed to submit something to us, and subsequently those hours are going to go by the wayside. And there are other things where it's like, well, unfortunately, there have been changes here, and even though we may consider it to be minor, unfortunately, those changes weren't submitted to us, and we have to do something with. We have to deny the license because those hours aren't considered valid.
I agree with all that discussion. I think one of the things that has struck me on these is there's the ones that have pained me the most, even if it was a substantial change, was the amount of time that went by and the hours that aren't going to count. which to me is a different problem than what we're talking about, the solution that we're talking about here. And so I just want us to also think about, are there other ways to also, I know that they have to sign that they'll do this. I still say some onus is on these supervisors. That concerns me a little bit. I wonder too, for those professions that have that training for board approved clinical supervisors, is this in the training? Is this hammered home? I don't know the answer to that. So these are just kind of some of the things I'm thinking about as well, to address this from multiple perspectives. To me, it's one of the most unfortunate things that we have to look at and do. But I don't want us to think that this is going, because I think we're still going to land on some things, right? They're going to go, yep, you should have told us. But when over half of their hours happened, and maybe that's the part that needs to be changed. I don't know. So I don't want us to overlook kind of kicking multiple stones to get somewhere with this issue.
Well, the most important thing is whether or not they got the clinical hours and they were working on the goals that they established at the beginning of their training plan. And, that's, you might be able to determine that even if they changed location or they changed jobs, but they went from one mental health agency to another one, and they were still doing therapy, and they were still, getting regular clinical supervision. But I think there's also an aspect that I agree that it's on the supervisor as well as the supervisee, but both have access to all of the written regs and requirements. And it seems that, that's part of what we're wanting with professionalization, is for people to be able to, jump through those hoops, if you will, to be able to follow a set of guidelines that define professional behavior. So I wouldn't want to eliminate the requirement altogether, but I agree that it could be modified, and we could talk about ways to avoid those situations where people lose so many of their hours.
All right, thank you. Now that takes us to an update on the contract with the Center for Credentialing and Educational Equivalency Reviews.
Yes, so at the last board meeting, one of the items on the agenda was to go ahead and enter contract negotiations with the Center for Credentialing and Education to provide some of the educational equivalency reviews. They did send a contract. I reviewed it. I asked our legal staff from Department for Aging and Disability Services to review it as well. I wanted to let you know I sent that back to CCE, and then they sent back a proposed. So it's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of work on the contracts. There is one item in particular that I thought would be helpful for the board to be able to discuss with legal counsel. And so I would like to ask the board if you would make a motion to go into executive session. You received an email from me earlier with information to go into that closed executive session. But basically it would be to discuss one of the items involved in the contract negotiation with the Center for Credentialing and Education, and to get some guidance from legal counsel on that topic as well. So, so with that, I have a motion here, and I believe that this type of executive session would not take very long, but I think if we plan to come back at perhaps 12:55, that would be sufficient. So that would leave about 15 minutes for the executive session. And then we would come back at 12:55. So I guess what I'd be asking is if a member of the board would be willing to make the following motion. Pursuant to KSA 75-4319, I move for the board recess into executive session for 15 minutes and convene the open meeting at 12:55 p.m. The meeting will be reconvened remotely by conference call at 1-877-278-8686, PIN number 327072, and by Zoom broadcast to the BSRB YouTube channel as directed in the notice of meetings that was sent to individuals who requested notice, and it's published on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. The justification for closure is consultation and discussion that would be deemed privileged with an attorney for the agency concerning a proposed contract. David Fye, Executive Director for the BSRB, and Jared Langford, the Board Legal Counsel, are to be included in the executive session, subject to be discussed in executive session as consideration of a proposed contract.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Richard, did you have a question?
Yes, one quick thing. The PIN number I have is from the email that you sent this morning is,
Richard, that email has a different PIN number. The email that I read in this motion, that's the public PIN number for individuals who are on the conference call. But the email you got this morning, that would have a different
okay,
because this will be a confidential one. So the one I just read in this motion, that's the one for the public, but the one you got in the email, that's the confidential one.
gotcha. Thank you for the
Very good.
clarification.
So we have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. We will recess into executive session.
And mute the conference call.
Anything else?
We should be okay.
So I can stay in here
You can stay here if you want.
because you're going your office. Easy to put them back, huh?
It's much easier.
Looks like we're all back. The next item is adjournment. Thank you all for your time and hard work today. Very, very busy agenda. Dave, do you know when we're scheduled to meet next?
The next meeting of the board will be the second Monday in May. Wait,
I'm sorry, you froze on me.
the next meeting of the board will be the second Monday in May, which should be May 8th.
Great.
For the school thing.
Yeah, and if there is something that comes up that's urgent with legislation, we could try to have a special short meeting. But the next full meeting would be on Monday, May 8th.
Very good. If there's no other business to come before the board, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Right on time, I might add.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Bye.
Have a wonderful week, all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.